Yeah, I just want to thank, or to start really by expressing my excitement to be here and my real sincere gratitude for Karma inviting me to participate, for creating this event, and especially to Keith for creating this incredible body of work, and really for being such a generous and thoughtful kind of collaborator in various ways over the last couple of years, getting to know you, both as an educator and as an artist. And as two folks invested in narrative art right across the street from one another, I think this is a great opportunity to talk about your work and some bigger issues as well. I also think it's a perfect opportunity, this show, City of Angels, this beautiful Los Angeles day, so gratitude to everyone who showed up as well. And also your first show in Los Angeles in 15 years, appropriately titled City of Angels. So we'll get into that. And honestly, I see my role here. It's been so great talking with you over the years and just yesterday about this series. And you talk in such eloquent ways, kind of connecting these big macro questions with more kind of specific and intimate biographical details that I'm going to let you do most of the talking and just be a kind of facilitator of that and try to get out of your way. And then to that end, I wanted to talk about the kind of, or at least start talking about the kind of major body of work that this is a part of. This is the kind of most recent chapter of a series of work you've been making for quite some time, My American Dream. And so I was wondering if you can just kind of start with that, kind of when that started, why it started, and how it's evolved over the course of the last few years.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Thank you so much for doing this. You guys, thank you so much for being here. It really means the world to me that you're all here, and just so lovely. And thank you, Karma Gallery, for having me and be part of your family and having this show here. It really is, I think, one of the highlights of my career, so I'm so super excited for all. And it really started in 2000, you guys. I was teaching at NYU. I'm now wonderfully a USC teacher. My kids are here in the audience, I'm so pleased and proud to say. And we heard we were living in Soho, my husband and I have to thank Andrew for all this show because he's really my #1 champion and best friend. And it's thanks to him I was able to get all this show done, and him, making sure to push me to be my best critic. Anyway, we've been together 35 years. We were together living in Soho in a super illegal sublet. When 9/11 happened, we heard the plane fly overhead, and on the news instantly we saw it. I walked out, and kind of like a Spielberg movie, I saw the hole with the people in it of the first tower. I staggered to class, a 9 a.m. drawing class for fine art at the beginning of the semester. We were all in shock. I teach comics. I teach composition via the gag cartoon, even for fine art classes. And I was like, guys, I don't feel like talking about cartoons right now. I don't know what to do, but let's go out and draw this thing. Because I always say, art's not necessarily therapy, but everybody's getting something out when they're making work. So I went to Washington Square Park. The kids got their sketchbooks open right in time for the first tower to fall. And the adults in the park started screaming and crying. My kids were great and saying, it's okay, and hugging, strangers. I was like, guys, class dismissed. Go home and call your parents, let them know that you're okay. But my dad was in town the day before. We had actually gone the Staten Island ferry because the Statue of Liberty tour was sold out and was raining. And we were coming back and we saw the towers, and we were thinking, my sister used to work there, hi Rivka, who's in this exhibition, in the Walt Disney painting. And we talked about that. My dad was an adventurer, and we were in Staten Island, and it's like, let's go to the fort, let's see what's going on. So we went to the fort, and we were like, oh my gosh, it's so great that America has never been invaded. We've never had to do that. And we had dinner after going around the Chelsea openings, which also had a weird offbeat edge. And my dad was like, which way is north to my cousin's house? And I was like, you could always look at the towers and see. So anyway, it happened, and Andrew and I had this whole whirlwind time living in Soho. It was literally a war zone. And I didn't want to do Bush's bad paintings. I didn't want to do stuff that was already bringing me down. It was the break of a new era, dawn of a new epoch. And I wanted to do things that made me happy, that made me feel good. I was too old to like horror movies. And so I wanted to choose images that were talismans to me of good energy, things that I felt were really my American dream. Hopefully that's not bad to say anymore. That allowed Andrew, who's Latino and part indigenous, to be a husband with me, for our families to all get along. In America, and I am a patriot, happy Memorial Day, just post, of what I love about America and this land and what's great about it, to try and remember the optimistic things. I always think painting is a meditation, and I always feel, for me, luckily I'm painting because it's my meds, especially in the Trump era, I'd be running down the street, pulling out my hair and screaming. I love teaching, but this is my oxygen mask. And so that started the whole My American Dream series that I've been doing since 2000. So 24 years later, I'm still at it. Each new show is like a new chapter. I keep building it. It's been 10 years since the Whitney Biennial, where I had sort of a coming attraction of the whole oeuvre. I've done hundreds of paintings. It feels like thousands. We collected them in a monograph that Karma published. Please, we're almost running out if you guys want a copy. Which I feel is sort of like a wordless novel where each page sort of talks to each other. And each of my shows, you guys, is a nonlinear narrative. I come from comics. One of the reasons Ryan and I know each other is that he's one of the first curators, as was mentioned by Nicole, of the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art. And back in the day when Don Bacalupe had come from Crystal Bridges to lead this giant unwieldy ship of Lucas, he called me because he said, oh my gosh, I hear that you're a narrative artist. High and low, you guys, is a false binary. Everybody knows that, right? I started a whole narrative art program at USC where I've been a full tenured professor now for 8 years. And when I was chair of 2D, I was like, I want to start a narrative art program. It was during the Kavanaugh hearings. And a lot of my kids in the comics class were from animation. The Lucas-funded School of Cinematic Arts and the gaming students, some of the best in the world, along with our wonderful Roski students, who are also amazing. And hopefully art makes the world a better place. I'm a big believer in Joseph Campbell, just like George Lucas, and he would say an artist's job is to tell stories for a culture to understand itself in order for that culture to progress. Hopefully in fine art, in our rarefied way, we do that. Teaching obviously helps. I've had many, many wonderful students who've gone out there in the world, have done great things, both for narrative art and fine art. Even have one of my students, Cash Cooper, who was my pre-college comics kid when he was 16 in 2006, and then ended up going to CalArts for animation, and then now doing fine art. And already, like, all the way going to the moon with his fine art, but still has his nibs and pins that he had from cartooning class. But yeah, I've had students who, like Nate Powell, who did March with Senator John Lewis, the trilogy about how John Lewis got started in the civil rights movement, who's in your museum. And many students who have also gone on to Hollywood with the millennial generation, they realized that comic artists were really good storyboard artists who to tell the stories outside of the CalArts box of like bringing it up through the nuts and bolts of animation. And I've had great fine art students too. You've gone on to do great things. And they're like, there's another one of my students. It's like really, it warms my heart that you guys are here. 6 years later, we have 9 classes in place, over 120 students. We're right between SCA, the School of Cinematic Arts, and your guys' wonderful museum, which will be opening up its doors in late 2025. I'm very proud to be part of the collection, thank you, with my ACT UP painting. But yeah, hopefully we fill the bandwidth that the cinematic school doesn't, where they're a little bit more nuts and bolts. We want to teach people to think like artists critically about the world. I always think if you can make something and look at it for a long time and think about it too, and it has mystery, it's art. And if it's on the wall, you call it fine art. If that same piece is in a book, like a Maurice Sendak, illustration, it's illustration. But narrative art's art for the world. And I try to keep it real for comics, not just by teaching comics. I was the head comics teacher at SVA for 25 years, where I also taught fine art, but organizing my shows in nonlinear narratives. And so this is hard for people to wrap their brains around. But if you go to cathedrals, you know that the frescoes are the Stations of the Cross. If you go to Mexico and you see the works of Diego Rivera and all the great muralists, you know that those are telling stories. But in a contemporary age, it's hard. When I've had salon shows, like at the Whitney, I think of the salon as a great compositional motif, where the paintings sort of talk to each other in that regard. When they're like this, like Horses in the Stable, more of a conventional hanging, I still think that each one is about an idea talking to another idea, each one hopefully isolated and alone speaks for itself allegorically and formally, but when you juxtapose it with something else, which is the semiotics of comics, one thing next to another thing, talking to each other, Scott McCloud in Understanding Comics calls it closure, when your mind becomes participatory in the creation of the ultimate content, when you're putting it together. Why am I seeing national parks and UFOs? Why am I seeing the cityscape of Los Angeles next to Cheech and Chong? Hopefully you become participatory in it, and even if people don't know that I'm a nonlinear narrative artist, and these are like comics on a wall where each painting is like a panel talking to each other, they still feel like they're taking on a journey where they're experiencing something because they're putting it together for themselves. That's part of the magic and the theater of a show. Yeah. But hopefully each one, like a missing locket on its own, stands on its own, but it's fun to have the theater of this. And I plan out the shows. Every writer needs a great editor. I am from Colorado, which is very near Texas, and so I am like all in usually and overstuff my shows. But Karma and I wonderfully edited works to figure out the best images. But like Stuart Comer at the Whitney and working with other wonderful curators such as yourself, they then allowed me to put it together specifically. So I Photoshop all of this. I know exactly the space in between each image. I really figure out the purview of what you see next to one another in the sort of 360 sense around idea of being inside a Mobius strip of paintings that are kind of like comics. Yeah. And then that room talks to this room in juxtaposition, and this chapter talks to my previous chapters and my hopeful future chapters.
Yeah. Well, see what I mean? There's a lot of incredible and dense information in there. And I feel like, for me, I think the roots in comics are really helpful to understand the work overall in so many ways. Like, in part, it's engagement with kind of iconic culture, with print culture, but also I think in this notion of series and sequencing. And I think it's interesting just to kind of think about the City of Angels piece of it, right? That this is a chapter 24 years into a series, which is also rare to sustain a series for that long. But to have a show about LA that's 24 years after you start a show, and in a place where kind of the notion of the kind of dream, especially the American dream, is often kind of associated with, so both through the dream factory of Hollywood and the kind of vision of suburban plenty of Los Angeles in the mid-century. So I'm curious about why the City of Angels and why Los Angeles kind of at this point? I mean, obviously you're living here, but what about LA do you feel like really kind of speaks to you?
So I grew up in the suburbs of Colorado. It looked a little bit like that Skateboarder magazine picture there, a lot of cul-de-sac suburbias. I mean, I grew up in a Robert Adams photograph, literally. I mean, he was taking those pictures right at the same time I was living in track home or near track home suburbias, built out amongst the plains. And in Colorado, we just like dreamed of being California. It was like our mecca. Students would bring surfboards to school, even if it was a blizzard outside. We were wearing OP shorts and Varney sunglasses. I'm aging myself, I turned 58 last week. So it was the 70s and it was the 80s. But really, the first room resembles a lot like the posters that were in my bedroom growing up. And it was the dreams of cultural media entertainment that helped to feed that in me to want to really move here. And I went to undergrad at Brown University. I have some of my cohorts here. I was a studio art and semiotics major. We have to do that show where we curate it, Rob, of studio art and semiotics. But I went to grad school at UC Irvine. One, I got like a free ride. Two, it was California. Three, Derrida and Leotard were there, so I got to sit in on those classes, and it was a building of a new program where Catherine Lord had come from CalArts and was firing and hiring a team of a cohort led by lesbians. Perfect. And a lot of my teachers in 1993 were in the wonderful 1993 Whitney Biennial. So it was gender identity politics with room to breathe. Larry Pittman was my great mentor. And I lived in Echo Park my first year out. I showed at Richard Tejas. My thesis show traveled around. I showed with DL's gallery, Kiki. in the Somar district, run by a wonderful guy named Rick Jacobson. Kathy Opie was there. She had run the Cage, believe it or not, when I was at UC Irvine checking out photo equipment. Neil and Blake brought Annie Philbin, at the time was at the Drawing Center, and so my show Pinocchio the Big Fag, I was going to do it as a comic book, but I realized it was so hard to do comics. It was like children's plates of a narrative that I invented that coincides supposedly with the original Pinocchio, where I was drawing in different styles to represent different times. And that traveled to New York, as I mentioned, then Richard Tejas Gallery here. So I was drawing puppets then. I'm painting Kermit now. Yeah. So there's a through line. I lived in Echo Park. My husband, Andrew, got into grad school in New York at the Graduate Center. So he got to work with Eve Sedgwick and Wayne Kustenbaum. So we were there for 25 years. But his family is all in Riverside. He was like, when the USC walkout happened, he was like, you better walk in. And so I applied, and they recruited me to teach art and comics under the same roof. And I had other offers to show here, but I really wanted to wait for the perfect opportunity. And of course, Karma made that possible by having it here. So this is a long time coming. I've been here for 8 years waiting for this show and really thinking about it. And so that first room is really dedicated to that. And it also has images that I've taken on my own camera, coinciding with the media culture. And then segues kind of like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, when Richard Dreyfuss is looking outside of his truck at the UFO. Cheech and Chong in that room are looking outside at a cop. I mean, but anyway, you come into this room, and for this room, it's a panorama. Kind of like at the Met when you're stepping into the center of Versailles. I wanted to be Sensoround 360, IMAX theater of painting. And I don't know if you guys have gone to Sago Canyon in Utah, but they have the petroglyphs of the UFOs and the aliens on rocks and cave walls. I thought, oh my gosh, this is a perfect allegory. Now we know UFOs are real, guys. The Earth isn't flat, nor is it the center of the universe. And the government and the Pentagon, thanks to the article that this painting was the basis of the photo that was featured in, Leslie Keane, broke the ice to say that UFOs are real, and the government admits it. I mean, the agnostic thing to say is they aren't necessarily little gray aliens in spaceships. We don't know what they are, but there are like these things that are flying around in our airspace that are beyond the technology that we're aware of, and it's a total mystery, but they're real. But for me, allegorically, I think if national parks are a place that we could all love, my theory is conservatives have to go to the Grand Canyon and be like, oh my gosh, the Grand Canyon. We want our grandchildren to be able to experience this. Hopefully that could open up the conversation for clean air and water, ideas about global warming, and hopefully how to reverse that. Our interdependence with one another and how we all have to get along and care for our flora and our fauna of our planet. Because if we don't do it, why are the UFOs here? Maybe they'll take care of it for us, and we probably don't want that. So I'm hoping people have a little bit of that experience in this room, and then they go back to the front room and they're like, oh my gosh, Cheech and Chong were right. Billie Jean King had a good idea about feminisms and everybody being equal, and we all need to be the Michael Jordan of our own championships and try to save ourselves and each other so we could save our planet, and thanks to today, our democracy.
Yeah. No, I mean, and I feel like, again, on this notion of sequencing and what you're saying when you come into this space, is this kind of crescendo moment, right? Where it really all of this kind of work comes together and, as you say, kind of speaks to each other as this kind of almost room-like installation. But I also think, back to the kind of sequencing piece and kind of building to this, when we were walking through yesterday, it seemed like you had a very specific way and a kind of cadence of kind of pacing through the space.
Yes.
And in some ways, it starts with Billie Jean King, which I think is a really fascinating thing, also as this kind of queer icon in some ways. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of how we get from Billie Jean King to UFOs, back to Michael Jordan. Obviously, we're kind of bracketed by two iconic athletes at the beginning, but anyway, just about that sequence and that story you're telling.
Okay, this is going to be hard, but I'm going to try. The first gallery is really devoted to the cultural heroes of Los Angeles and California that made me want to move here when I was a kid, including Billie Jean King opening up the show, holding up the disc of the Wimbledon plate, which comes in later with the flying saucers from 1975, overcoming all odds. next to Jim Henson, surrounded by his cosmology of wonderful Muppets that ideologically helped to influence the world, and myself, inspired by Disney, here represented by Mickey Mouse in the center with humans around it. My sister and I, when I was 6 years old, visiting Disney World, standing in for Disneyland for the first time. Baudrillard says that Disneyland was the simulacra that helped Los Angeles seem more real. Here, Los Angeles represented from my own photo, a picture I took from a plane of LA, the sort of seeming, thriving metropolis that's expanded out forever with millions of denizens, helping the busy beehive of it to grow. As we close in on LA's most popular denizens, maybe, Cheech and Chong, who influenced me when I was a kid, not just about bohemian culture, but how living with a bromance with a Latino husband could be a cool thing. I'm proud that I've been with Andrew now for 35 years. They're looking out of the car, kind of like Richard Dreyfuss in Close Encounters of Their Kind, looking at a UFO, which brings us to the UFO paintings. Here, the Phoenix lights witnessed by tens of thousands of people overlooking Phoenix when these lights were hovering overhead, from a video still next to Monument Valley from my own camera of a beautiful rainbow happening after a rainstorm that I witnessed at Monument Valley, being a fan of John Ford and all things West that represent everything that could happen in this liminal space. Next to a triad of paintings, one of the first daylight photos of a UFO taken by US Coast Guard in Salem, Mass. Next to one of the most recent famous UFO pictures from 2017 that covered the New York Times. Front page was the gimbal UFO that helped to inspire people to realize that UFOs, or UAPs as they're now called, are real and hovering in our world space. Next to the Joshua Tree painting from my own photo when I visited there with my dad, hopefully an optimistic ultimate circle of life picture about how this giant yucca tree, even though it's been fallen, is growing new outgrowths for the world in the future. Next to another national park painting of Rocky Mountain National Park from my own photo when I visited there with my folks. We used to see this scene growing up all the time. It's really part of who I am, and I love it as well as I love the Hudson River School and going out west for everything that could represent. Next to the Costa Rica UFO painting where a flying saucer was caught hovering over the Costa Rica coastline next to a lake. The best UFO ever taken, next to one of the best space pictures ever taken by the James Webb Telescope, the cosmic cliffs where thousands of new stars are being born. And maybe some of those people hovering around those stars have visited Earth, like in this image of the Battle of Los Angeles from the cover of the LA Times in 1942. Where it really brings the universe to our world. And going into the next room, going back to Earth, is Skateboarder Magazine with this kid doing one of his famous wheelie tricks in Southern California from a magazine that started the whole Dogtown Z-Boy revolution that made my friends and I want to move to California growing up. Next to a picture from my own photo of Laguna Beach. This is the sunset at Seal Rock, a famous iconic image of a scene that happens every night in this beautiful part of the world that's also sort of a post-apocalyptic landscape of heron and seals congregating on this rock underneath the mammoth, beautiful, sublime sky, which finally is next to Space Jam, the famous Michael Jordan movie with the Looney Tune gang from 1997, the most popular basketball film or sports film ever made, with Michael Jordan, the great hero for us all, next to some of the heroic Looney Tunes that taught us to laugh, but also think about the foils of life in this film where they're abducted by aliens and recruit Michael Jordan to help them save themselves and our planet from the great beyond, hopefully inspiring us, like we're looking at the flanking Billie Jean King and Michael Jordan paintings, to be the best at what we could be to save the world and ourselves and the planet. Phew.
When I taught at NYU, I taught a senior integrated liberal arts class, and we did have a UFO week. And it was UFOs instead of religious painting. Because I felt, religious painting, it's denominational, like it's weird. But when you're talking about Fra Angelica and Duccio, you're talking about people who really people who fervently believed in what it was that they were telling, that they felt guided, that they had a passion for something for a reason. And synesthetically, you could feel that. You could feel the emotion in those paintings. Even if you're not a believer, you have an experience. I think being our best is something that we always have to remind ourselves to do. I think Billie Jean King's not religious. Michael Jordan, kind of. But they have a higher calling. They really want to be the best of what that is that they're doing, because it's not just for their own egos. They don't want to win the championships just for themselves. They want to do it for the people that they represent. Obviously, Billie Jean King is my one overt shout out to LGBTQIA plus representation. Michael Jordan wasn't so political. I've done a lot of paintings of LeBron, who is. But by just being his best and being a real life superhero who could basically fly. I always tell the kids, you have to be Beyonce about it. You have to be in control of your stuff and not let, my pithy epiphany about postmodernity is that it's about agency being reified into capital, who we are as spirits and souls, being folded like flour in a pizza dough of the capitalist machine. You know, when Warhol was making his pictures of Marilyn, that's kind of like what happened to her, or Elvis. I love Warhol, I love my dad. Punk rock's about killing your father. I kind of feel like Warhol's a little bit like that. I mean, I've had many amazing students who are on the spectrum, but touchy-feely's not necessarily their thing. I always feel like if you can marry a Rembrandt, who I love for his emotions and his feelings and his painterliness, with the popular iconography and relatability of a Warhol, maybe you would have something. Yeah. And so those cultural heroes, that's hopefully in honor of them and who they are as people, really a tribute. Adam Weinberg, the former director of the Whitney, called me a history painter. I'm very honored that I have paintings there, 3 paintings and 4 drawings, including a drawing of Billie Jean King in a Rising Up series with Juana Rovich and Marcia P. and Sylvia Rivera and Harvey Milk, but also of 9/11 for the inaugural show. They put that up, and it was really moving, and with a heavy heart that painting was there, because of course I did experience it, as I mentioned to you. But people would be standing in front of it crying, or better yet, telling their stories, pointing to the painting to tell their kids about what happened. And I think as a history painter, what you need to do is make things that are warm and emotional and painterly, get people involved from the gut so they're feeling it. In addition to the representation of what it is in terms of history, but that's what makes it real. And of course, we have to remember our history so we don't repeat it.
Yeah.
Can't let the Nazis take over.
Yeah.
For Billie Jean King, it's a tribute to her, but then everything that she represents for LGBTQAI plus people, to feminisms, to tennis, to people with 4 eyes. My sister and I both wore glasses when we were kids. My parents played tennis. I was too gay to do that. But they were like, oh my gosh, Billie Jean's on TV, guys, come on in. We were all listening to, I'm a Woman, Here We War, Helen Reddy. My sister had the Dorothy Hamill haircut, and she was like our hero, And yeah, she helped me, guide my spirit to who I could be. I'm hoping, I love my fellow travelers and our cohorts. Everybody gets a blue ribbon, but we all want to be the best as who we could be. And try to strive for the good fight and make the world a better place in every way that we can. So that's Billie Jean King and Michael Jordan sort of framing this at the end of the show to make you feel good as you're going out and think, I want to be a champion too.
I mean, I think for me, this notion of, you mentioned Warhol, right? And I think that and also history painting, the pop gesture of kind of appropriating popular culture, right, which is something that you see in a lot of this work, seems kind of evident. But the way that you talk about it, especially the way that you just talked about Billie Jean King, right, it's so deeply rooted in love, right, like a proper love, like in a way that, Warhol was about coolness, about detachment. Like he may have loved Marilyn, but it doesn't come across that way. He didn't talk about it in that way. And also even history painting, right, which is supposed to, in some ways, supposed to have an objective lens. It's not supposed to be necessarily something that you love in that way. So I wonder if you could talk about the function of that love in the work. I mean, especially thinking about someone like Jim Henson and the Muppets, who appear so many times in your work and are obviously the cover of that big, beautiful book. So I wonder if you could just talk maybe specifically about your love for
Sure.
that work.
I mean, like a method actor, I try to suture into my paintings, or Scott McCloud would say, you suture into the avatar of the character that you're rendering, so hopefully the viewer could do that too. So I'm listening to audiobooks about my subjects while I'm painting them. I'm listening to music, very specifically playlists that are very specific to each one to kind of train my left brain into thinking on the right way as my right brain is doing its own analytical thing. But really devoting myself, kind of like a documentarian, to my subject where I'm really in love with what it is that I'm painting. And I want to be able to feel it in my own self, to be able to channel that synesthetically, where I don't know if you guys know synesthesia, it's like you see the word orange, but you're feeling the color in your mind's eye, where you could feel something. I mean, I think oil painting has the ability to make, things look more real than anything beyond photography. But I think in our age, post-Warhol, post-Richter, our job is to penetrate the picture and go into the world of it, and use it as an objective reality that, like Cézanne painting his Mount Saint Victoire, be able to have our unconscious driving our breath as much as our conscious is driving it, and whatever that emotion or that feeling is to come through. One of the texts I love to teach is Roland Barthes' The Third Meaning, which is about Eisenstein film stills. And Eisenstein loved Disney, he loved Chaplin, he loved painting. But one of the reasons that those movies are so moving beyond the propaganda, which was the obvious symbolic that he was trying to get across, so the Russian censors wouldn't censor him, is the feeling and the emotion that could come through in a composition of the framing. Because then if you have people by the gut, it creates more mystery and a gut feeling. And then if you're spending so much time painting something, I love Proust. I don't know if you guys like remembrance of things past, but it begins with him biting into a Madeleine, one of those French cookies, and sends him into this reverie of feeling and memories. And for each one of these, the photo that I'm working on is that talisman for my memories, for my feelings to come through, which is something that hopefully is transmuted into the work. When I would take my kids to the Met, we would look at the Rembrandt paintings, and I would say to them, you guys, we don't know who a lot of these people are of, but you're feeling who they are as people, and you're feeling his projection of what he thinks about for the entire scene. Like Homer contemplating a bust of Aristotle. He's like James Dean. He's like a method actor putting on the shoes of his characters, creating allegories that are meaningful to him, because the extra stuff that happens, especially with the old masters, the reason that they're the old masters, despite all the politics, is that there's something that transcends the commission. It transcends the subject matter. There's something about those paintings that for me is alive. The batteries are included. I know it's my own inner mind projecting onto it, but there's something that you could feel that in some ways is palatable, that emotion, that feeling. And I think that's something that painting could do still in this day, especially in the digital age, is that we're working with oil paint from the blood of dinosaurs, through the wood of our brushes and the animal hair or synthetic hair, and the walnut oil that I use, and that you're thinking your thoughts, and hopefully consciously what's happening is it's looking like you want it to, but unconsciously there's something that's happening that's transcending into your paint that makes it go beyond its subject matter, that hopefully if we could capture that brass ring, like on a Ferris wheel or a merry-go-round, would be the thing that ultimately gives the work a life of its own, that makes it timeless as well as timely, that maybe even evokes the sublime.
Yeah. Well, and I think also, the ways that we attach ourselves to certain popular cultural texts, right? Like that becomes a form of love that is really unique, like the fanaticism associated with that. Yeah. And then also the kind of accrued memory of nostalgia that you're kind of also speaking to, like you said, your childhood bedroom. Yeah. And again, to the kind of Jim Henson piece, that's something that, imprints itself on most children at a young age, and it did in your case, right? Because you were saying you're kind of the perfect time to have connected with that.
So I turned 58. Sesame Street came out when I was like 4, so I was perfect age for that. Muppet Show came out when I was like 6, and so perfect age. I grew up with those guys. I grew up with Disney was kind of like the Uncle Walt. It was like the weird grandpa who was kind of like a god. And so I had revered respect for him in those movies and stuff, but like the fuzzy animal or whatever they are, antics of the Muppets with Jim Henson, who, you know, he grew up as a Christian Scientist. Thankfully, he wasn't religious. He did that weird spiritual kind of thing. He felt like there was a life inside of things and just beyond our own dimension, like Fraggle Rock, came from a real place. But he really wanted to entertain the masses and make the world a better place through his work. He wanted to entertain people and make them laugh, but there was something extra that was happening. When Sesame Street came about, it was really because of the civil rights movement. And they had civil rights leaders who were their mentors for that program. And having the Muppets, who are all colors of the rainbow, no genitalia, really critically talking in a funny way, maybe unconsciously, about ideas of gender and sexuality, were my keystones growing up in the suburbs of Colorado into cultural politics, into gender theory, into queer theory. I was entertained and I loved them. I teach painting, you guys, the same way I teach comics. I feel like if you're drawing a cartoon character and smiling and you find you're smiling too, you know you're doing good. When you're teaching painting and you're like in the headspace of the meditation of the painting and you're able to transcend into that work, it feels good. It's like brain yoga. Same with puppeteering. Like you're making something that doesn't have a life animated. You make it alchemized. And so for me, that brain yoga is what it's about. And when you're suturing into avatars of these great entertainment, you know, people who have made the world a better place, you're also learning something. And reading the books and stuff, I learn a lot. And they're great cultural leaders. You know, obviously Jim Henson's super successful, but he never sold his soul for rock and roll. He kept it real. He was like Beyonce, in control of his stuff. He was a great innovator in, just like Disney. We were talking, you know, Fantasia was an experimental, weird movie. But he was totally for it. He invented lands that literally people live in, happiest places on earth, but also creating ideologies. I also teach Althusser, that you guys probably know, the ideas of the panopticon and the repressive state apparatus, the police, but more importantly, the ideological state apparatus, He would say, why are there no revolutions? Why doesn't that happen? Why aren't people rioting all the time? Well, they're worried about getting arrested in the court of law. Nobody's above it, thank goodness. But also more than that, you watch yourself sometimes because of the ideologies that you grew up with. Maybe, hopefully, in a good way with your family, sitting around the dinner table if people are still eating together and breaking bread. Church or religious institutions that are hopefully good, teaching you good practices. School, obviously, one of the reasons it's so important to teach. Because that's the main thing that helps people make the world a better place when they get out. But also our cultural entertainments, what we're watching, what we're reading. That really helps to form our consciousness. I know Disney did too many princess movies. They're smarter now. Pixar is better. But the Muppets also, really taught me how to live and what to think in a great way. And this is such a rarefied world. I still love it. There's nobody art directing me here. It is my oxygen mask. But the neat thing is to be able to teach fine art people and narrative art people, because they're going out into the world and in an even bigger way are making the world a better place. And so that's how I'm building my empire. If it's not my empire, but it's ideologically making sure that I'm taking responsibility to pass the baton.
Yeah, I love that. And so I guess, it'd be good to move into this gallery since we're here and since we're situated right in front of this, really quintessential image about UFOs or UAPs, I guess, as they're now called. But I'm curious about when your kind of interest in creating these kind of started, kind of what they're doing for you, and also, the relationship between the kind of City of Angels and this narrative of UFOs, because we get, I think, really one image of Los Angeles in this room. So I'm just curious, and that's a lot of things.
Yeah, of course. Yes, that first room is really bringing it down to earth, what we could do on our earthly way. I've been into UFOs since day one. I'm too old for horror movies, as I mentioned, but any movie that has a ship in space, I'm totally there for it. My husband, too. And I love just thinking about the great beyond. I'm kind of like Jodie Foster in the movie Contact. who says at the end to the kids, like, I'm totally paraphrasing, the universes are so huge, like, it'd be a huge space for just us to be in it. And there has to be, like, people running around out there. I don't know if they visited Earth. I have sort of my own misty memories of, seeing things back in the day. But I love the wonder of it and the thought of it. And, I love Turner and the idea of the Kantian sublime, where you feel a small part of a much bigger thing. And if you can objectify yourself in a good way and realize that you're part of a bigger thing, then again, the interdependence happens, and hopefully the sublime feeling. And then you Kant wasn't sure if an artist could do that, but Turner was trying. Hopefully you feel good about yourself enough that you want to help each other and help the planet move along. And I'm hoping these are kind of like Turner-esque. I feel like Turner was really into science. You guys might know this, like he was really into the weather, talking to the scientists of his time that were really revolutionized the way that we thought that the world worked. I feel like if he could have high definition cameras, if he could have printers, I could look at really good, like glossy photos like I look at, he would probably use them. And he probably loved the idea of the UFOs. I'll talk about this one just in particular because it's right behind us. So this is the gimbal UFO. This is one of the 3 images that was on the cover of the New York Times. All the UFO paintings in this show were based on famous, yet to be debunked UFO incidents. And so if you're into UFOs, you'd be like, oh, Phoenix Lights. First daylight photo of a UFO from Salem, Mass. in '54. The best photo ever taken according to Leslie Kean, who broke this story from Costa Rica in 1971. The Battle of Los Angeles from 1942. These are all grainy, black and white images. And so I feel my job as an artist is, again, to penetrate the photo. If it's black and white, of course, to make it into color. And I like to paint the pixels as if they're real. I know they're not real. But teaching comics all these years, I think about multiverses and things like that. And it's funny when you really look at the details of things, your mind's eye, kind of like when you're looking at clouds and you see faces in them, cognizes what you're looking at. You start seeing faces. You start seeing eyes. I think the way that your mind articulates detailed information to organize it in your inner mind is that you start seeing like reverse eyes. Da Vinci would say that an artist paints themselves. And I think what he meant by that is that sometimes a bad artist paints a portrait of somebody and it kind of looks like the artist. But I also think you project like your own mind's eye into something. I have a theory like with Cézanne paintings, if you look at the center of them, they have what I call the Cézanne hole. And inverted, you could see eyes, you could see mustaches and teeth. Van Gogh definitely does this. Check out the cypress trees in a Van Gogh painting and start thinking about what he looked like. And you'll see profiles of Van Gogh, his eyes, his nose, his red mustache and beard, all of that. And so I start looking at these, I start looking at the details. Again, like for something like this, I'm listening to the big players. I'm listening to Beethoven symphonies. I'm listening to Mozart. I'm listening to opera. I'm not an opera queen per se, but I want like the big, booming, kind of overwhelming feeling of the gestalt of it all. I'm watching the UFO films and the videos, of course, that this is about. You could see the video online. All these are titled, by the way, in a way that you could Google them and see them. I freeze the frame so it was just as the pilot's going like, gee Whittakers, like that thing is like rotating and there's a whole fleet of them. Because compositionally it was really good. Speaking about Turner, the Fighting Tamara, that famous painting at the National Gallery of the steam tugboat pulling in the old ship that was the heroic ship about like the changing of the guard of technology, maybe even Britain, turned out compositionally to be perfect for this. It was infrared photography. And so I had to turn it around. It was the negative of this because I was looking at heat, and the saucer in the middle was like black because it was the hottest thing. So I'm turning around in my head. Also, personally, gets really weird and personal, you guys. I'm not the Hollywood medium. I'm not pretending to channel anybody, even though sometimes, like when I was painting the end of the Henson painting, I was listening to the funeral when Brian Henson, his son, is dictating the letter that was written to the kids about forgive everybody, life's too short, enjoy it. I'm like weeping and going like, oh, Jim, thank you so much. When I was painting this, so my cousin Andrew had mental health issues, and he was living in a home, a really good home, that my godmother and my cousin Deborah would visit him every week, and he was really a friend of the family. And the day I was finishing this painting, you guys, like Andrew was coming into my mind all the time, like really vivid images of him and stuff. I'm like, why am I thinking about Andrew so much? And the next day I found out he had died when I was painting this, and I was like, what? Fuck. And so I kind of, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious, but I kind of finished it by like helping him go into the great beyond or something by painting elements of this. I'm thinking about helping him into that space. But these things get personal, and you never know in the meditation of something. Maybe I take too much melatonin at night to sleep. Maybe it's too much matcha. Drugs are bad, art is good. I always tell the kids. But I'm deep in the meditation of these things. And I love that though, because the right brain is channeling something. And my father's a retired psychoanalyst, but he would say we don't know everything about dreams. Like we haven't figured it out. Freud didn't really know. I mean, he knew a lot, but he didn't really know. And what are dreams made of? And I always think if we could project our dreams onto a screen, they would look like weird, like smiley faces or ghosts, and we were like, oh, that's Grandpa. But that's also part of the power of comics, having a reduced essence of an iconography that our minds get connect to. But it's also, I think, how sometimes faces or eyes or things that are elements in painting subconsciously help to embed themselves into work to drive the work. I was also looking at like Fra Angelica, like Last Judgment paintings and stuff, and he would put like a Jesus figure or something in front of an icon that would be like a weird, like almost like flying saucer eye that would be like an aura. And I know he's like feeling the religiosity of what he's doing. And he's like, of course this has to be a Jesus painting and painting Jesus on top of it. So.
Exactly. Well, and I think that's really fascinating. Like, and it's in some ways a perfect metaphor for UFOs, what you're talking about in terms of the way we read into pixelation, for example, or granularity, and start to see things. Because UFOs are fascinating in the sense that they are kind of Rorschach. You're projecting a lot onto them, and I think, and the thing in the Battle of LA image is so fascinating because, the ways in which, like, for example, Hollywood movies have given us a perception of what the UFO is and what it's there to do, which it tends to be destructive, extinction level events. And so the idea that, in post-Pearl Harbor, you see something in the sky and it's a violent threat, is a projection of that kind of cultural moment, but also of things that we've heard and said and read and seen, right?
It's funny, Spielberg made the movie 1942 with Belushi and Aykroyd. He didn't have any aliens in it, but he was just coming down from Close Encounters. So I was like, But that is a very famous event. It was 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor. There was a Japanese submarine off the coast of Santa Barbara that sent some shell that caused $500 worth of damage. But we were all on point, like the whole military, all of Southern California was acting on guard. And there were these weird blips that appeared on our radar. And then all of a sudden they came over the coastline and tens of thousands, supposedly, people saw them. And immediately started shelling the heck out of them. It's like sending it, and that's a picture of, like sending all these shells and stuff. But then it mysteriously disappeared and they didn't find any fragments of it or anything. That appeared on the cover of the LA Times, kind of like it's a nice bookend to this, because this was the New York Times. In 1942, everybody across the world saw that image. They did distort it, the people at the press, because the original photo has since come out, and it's underdeveloped. It's really dark. You can't really see that much. But the elements that are in there were basically the same. They added like one spotlight, but the main kind of weird reverse silhouette of the saucer was there. The lights were there. I felt like, millions of people have been looking at this image for so many years. I want to go with the original, the Times image. Plus, I couldn't get a high definition image off it online from the original. But yeah, there was so much distortion in it, and yet you could still recognize the Hollywood Hills. And but I think about all the eyes are thinking about what these things have meant then and now, and thinking of it as a popular culture image. And yeah. All the conspiracy theories. I know for like Fox and so on, like it is like a bright, shiny object in the sky that people are trying to direct people's attention away from the atrocities of Trump to look at. But beyond the noise and the more important cultural things that are happening in our time, I think the phenomena that UFOs are real, or UAPs, that the government calls them to get over the stereotyping, kind of like comics. Like, you know, Dr. Wortham made comics like a bad thing in the 50s and said it started juvenile delinquency, which started the whole thing of comics are for kids and they weren't mature. But UFOs, they got with Project Blue Book, which tried to debunk that image and some of the other ones. You know, the main people from there, like Dr. Hynek and so on, came out and said, like, no, you know, these were real things that were happening, at least 20% of them or something, and I was told to debunk them and say they're weather balloons. But the neat thing about our moment is, like, yeah, we could say that these things are real, and it's interesting.
Yeah,
it gives you a sense of wonder. And hopefully they aren't here to take care of the planet for us.
Or destroy it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, that idea that they're real, right, like kind of does decenter like this notion that somehow humans are unique, or that we are somehow the inheritors of the universe. And I think it does have almost inherently a kind of transcendental, kind of cosmological, metaphysical meaning to say that they're real in a way that's, you know, kind of diminished when you just think, oh, that's an interesting thing, but it has this really, really deeper meaning. And I think that's visible in some of these. I mean, I feel like that painting in particular, but really many of them, the ways that, and you mentioned Turner, but like the way there's this kind of romantic idea there, right? That there's like some kind of existence of God in this sublime image, and like you get that very much looks like like, you know, like the image of the Holy Spirit in a Renaissance painting.
Well, I also love the Hudson River School, and growing up in Denver, I was too young and naive to appreciate the museum at that time, but they have an amazing Western art collection. And now I love Bierstadt and Thomas Moran. And yes, there are bad politics, colonialist politics involved with the Hudson River School and Manifest Destiny and making the West this incredible utopic space that you want to visit. Anyway, but there's still stuff that you can embrace about it. And, you know, there are no UFOs in these things per se, but I went there with my family. This was right near Estes Park. This is Rocky Mountain National Park. And these are from my own photos. My friend who passed away, so his spirit servant here, fashioned my lens to take advantage of my Sony A7 mirrorless camera. And so I like this sort of like that iris shot, like you would have in silent movies to begin or end a scene. But I'm thinking about like the big thoughts. My dad just turned 91. My mom's 86. They'll be here on Saturday. But thinking about mortality and my own place, you know, in the universe, and all the things that I was too young and naive to appreciate growing up, going skiing and hiking in the mountains, but really feeling it now. And yeah, seeing things in the clouds. Like I definitely saw this sort of Father Time-like figure. But then to the left of him is my cousin was like, oh my gosh, that's like a slalom skier. I'm like, you're totally right, it's exactly that. But obviously my mind's eye was seeing things in the clouds. And yeah, I like to paint the pixels if they're real, but also the lens flares too. And like the great beyond of whatever the sun, the lens flares could conjure in my own imagination, hopefully other people's. And also like the little circles that are like sort of Wizard of Oz, you know, Glinda Goodwitch bubbles, you know, floating around. That could be otherworldly too. And hopefully it makes it contemporary. And I love the American transcendentalist spirit. You know, John Muir has been canceled, but he used to think that in nature, everything's alive, and, you know, helped to save the national parks and all of that. So I'm thinking about those things too with these nature ones. The Monument Valley is also from my own camera. In Joshua Tree, I went there with my dad last year, and, you know, they were cutting down the Joshua trees during COVID like evil people. I don't know what they were thinking. But that one had fallen, and I pulled over with my dad. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's it, to talk about global warming and thinking about mortality. But Beyonce's new album, Cowboy Carter, had just come out. And so I can't say I'm part of the beehive, although my kids would say, well, testify that we do play it nonstop in advanced painting in the background. But I was painting to Beyonce, Cowboy Carter, which was perfect. You know, she grew up in Houston, and so she has like a conflicted relationship with Texas, maybe. It's not just Trump territory, there are good people there too. And in her own relationship to Western music, my own relationship to Western painting it's part of the core of me. You know, it's what I grew up with. But I have, you know, a queer distance to it. I ultimately want this to be optimistic, you know, all of these, like where there's new growth there is happening with the yucca that's happening underneath the dead tree, and yucca that's happening in the background that hopefully is more like the circle of life, and how all these things have rainbows that are hopefully not the end of our story, but the beginning or a transition to the better one. If we could just get over this hump, save democracy with a small d. The reason that the right's so powerful, you guys, and so upset is because the left is doing great. LGBTQIA has been never better. People of color are like wonderfully like so much the leaders of our world, and the minorities are the majority, and like it's like such a kumbaya generation, you guys. If we could just get over it and move forward and get really into the 21st century, I think it could be utopia for all.
I love that. Wow.
Hope so.
I mean, I feel, that almost seems like the right place to end, but I do have another question. And I want to leave some time for questions from the audience as well. And I just feel like I wouldn't be a good former photo curator if I didn't ask just a little bit about process, because
Sure.
I am really interested in that, the role and function of photography in this, and how you see yourself vis-a-vis that medium, because you also, photograph these images, and you have, professional cameras and all that. So just curious.
I'm a wannabe photographer, fine art photographer, I really am. And I had this epiphany years ago. Like, I'm a child of the pictures generation too. So I grew up with, all that wonderful postmodern art. And, I was a huge fan of them. And Duchamp, David Hammond's the greatest living artist, as we're all children of Duchamp in so many ways. But I had this moment in my studio one day where I was like, oh my gosh, like, I hopefully own these images. Hopefully they're not plagiarism, they're appropriation. I'm putting my own spin onto them. I'm looking into them like the Skateboarder magazine, to try to be in that world. But I also realized I wasn't the originator of a lot of these images. Ingrid Sishi at the time, for what turned out to be her last issue of Interview, hired me to cover the haute couture shows in Paris. I was like so excited. And I was taking all these pictures with my crude cell phone, and I was like, wow, maybe I do have a compositional eye. Like, I have been looking at photos for so long, and luckily she liked them. They were in the magazine and so on. I'm trying to convince Will Welch at GQ, who's a friend who has a Grateful Dead, me dressed as a preppy going to a Grateful Dead concert. It's a whole other story. So please let me go back. But I started taking images with my own camera and feeling that sense of ownership and authorship. And there's something different, I think, when you're looking at a photo that you yourself took, that you yourself experienced, where you could really relive that moment in an intrinsic, real way. I grid my photos. And I really do think about Bonnard and Vuillard. I think we could go back to the origin of photos as a reference when we're painting now. And those guys were doing the first, before Pollock, all over paintings, because they were looking at every little detail that was captured in the image. And so I'm gridding them. It necessarily abstracts the image, because I'm just looking at the squares. I always tell the kids to please fill up all the squares if you're gridding before you transcend the squares. And I do a first layer Gamsol. Just, dress rehearsal, getting all the colors in place. Second layer with the walnut oil, allowing myself to breach the squares. Then I print out the image again, and then it's like it's like skiing too. In Colorado, it's like skiing a powder run, the first run, because I'm making my own paths for the first time. By the end, it's like a mogul field, because I've already been over everything with my 00 brush. I'm a tiny brush painter, you guys. If I'm not teaching, I'm painting. If I'm not painting or teaching, I'm doing art world stuff, but I've been living these works for 2 years, and I get to those fine hairs where I'm doing it all over, looking at every little detail of my high-res image of my photo. But again, I think our job post-Richter is to be able to penetrate the photo, go into that space, make the color world alive, and how it's not like the photo is what's me about it, and hopefully why I won't get sued.
Well, I definitely hope that doesn't happen. That's a beautiful way, I think, to kind of conclude, and then also open up for additional questions from the audience if there are any. And if not, that's okay. Yeah.
Before you go, can I hand you this microphone?
Sure. Oh, okay.
All right.
I feel like you've sort of talked about it, but I feel like especially in this room, there's such an attention to the sky, and the colors that you're finding in the sky. And I'm wondering, I guess, what the sky sort of means to you, in your paintings, when you're painting it, but also outside of that. when you see it?
Well, again, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, but like skies are like heavenly, right? They're the great celestial beyond. And the neat thing about them too is that there's less specificity. They're easier to paint. I'm bringing it up all at the same time, but like the form, the ground is sort of like the mogul field, and the sky is sort of like when you're like just like doing cruiser runs. But that's why I always tell the kids, like, you know, painting is a little bit like a Harry Potter pensieve. You know, like every brushstroke is like a thought that you're putting out, spilling out. And so it doesn't haunt you anymore. After I did my 9/11 paintings, I didn't have any nightmares about them anymore. But when I'm doing the sky, I feel really liberated. And it's just really fun to go for it. And to think about the bigger thoughts about why we're here, why our existence is here. And again, I believe in UFOs. I want to believe like the X-Files. But when you're looking at the sky, it really is about like the great beyond and what it all means. And it really situates yourself on our own Earth and planet. And it's fun to paint because they're cruiser runs. I think behind you, there was a question.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks, Duncan.
Thanks.
Really fascinating to hear you talk. I'm having the experience of feeling like I'm on an aircraft, like sitting in these rows, looking out here,
That's
and
what
there's
I
the
want.
cockpit. So I appreciate the attention to the spacing of the paintings.
Thank you.
I thought I knew Norman Rockwell until I went to the Norman Rockwell Museum. And just hearing you talk, that kept coming up for me because I realized that he was, he didn't consider himself a fine artist, but even in the way you apply the paint, I see some connection.
Thank you.
But he
Okay.
was also very civic-minded and politically minded and thought about representation and had a sense of humor.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you think about him at all or have any relationship to his work.
Well, it's so funny you bring that up because, of course, the Lucas Museum is in the house, and you guys are championing Norman Rockwell along with everybody else. I grew up, again, loving art in general, but comics were my access to art. The New Yorker, that's why I wanted to be a New Yorker cartoonist when I was a kid, just out of college. But my dad did have the Norman Rockwell monograph, on the coffee table with him on the cover looking, over at the mirror. And so that was like really intrinsic in me, I have to say. And sometimes when you see Rockwell, I like paintings that you want to run your fingers through or lick. Like you see them in person, they're a little chalky. They're a little like fingernails on the chalkboard a little bit. Sometimes they're a little one-to-one, one might say, and yet the reason that Rockwell is so great is that he really did change culture. And I love artists/illustrators who do that. And there are a few wonderful, prominent examples. And Norman Rockwell really did create a whole idea of what America is that we could put into critical context now today. Who are the people getting that turkey at the dinner? That's been so lampooned because they're all rich white people. It's the Andy Griffith show. They're in the South, but there are no black people. It's crazy, and there are no women except for Aunt B. Norman Rockwell's funny, but then he also did. When they had integrated schools, they had that famous image of her going to school for the first time in the South, which, he was smart, and he realized the responsibility of his power to convey those images. So I do think about Rockwell, and I think he's a great artist, again, who's a feeder drug for other people too. I love Grant Wood. I've done appropriations of American Gothic with the Muppets from the Muppet calendar, appropriating Grant Wood. And Grant Wood was somebody who obviously did fine art, and he also did illustration, and he was queer. And so living in the Midwest, he got a lot of flack. The politics of academia are so intense because there's so little at stake, but there were a lot of egos that were at the school too, trying to drive him out, who were in ABX and not who he was. His best friend died from a car accident, like one of my best friends did around the same age. And so I think about Grant Wood and people like that a little bit more. But I love the Norman Rockwell because he was and is a hero for art. And growing up in the suburbs of Colorado, he was my access to art and what art could be as a transition. And to make things, there was another key sort of rosebud moments for me where there were there was a Peanuts book saying there is, yes, Charlie Brown, there is a Santa Claus, where it mixed Charles Schultz great cartoon characters with Victorian illustration. So there is that weird, like, kind of meta thing where you have the cartoon character in a real world. Also, this is one of Spiegelman's great influences too, Mickey Rodent in early Mad, where Mickey Mouse is a bad guy and he ends up trapping Daffy Duck in a zoo that turns out to look like an EC comic, horror comic, where it's like realistically drawn people with Donald Duck in a cage at a zoo, which was this weird sort of meta thing. There was an early Muppet book of the Muppet Show where the Muppets were rendered in colored pencil volumetrically. So making things kind of like Kermit on a bike in the Muppet movie, where you see this puppet all of a sudden didn't have strings like Pinocchio and he was real in our world. I love that idea. And Norman Rockwell, of course, painted so realistically, but he was making these fantasies palatable and real, and so you could live in them. To me, was like really amazing, and to be able to render like that was really key, and to have that kind of cultural influence. I don't think there could be an illustrator before Sense that had that dynamic idea of what the American dream could be. That critically, we could historicize him a little bit, forgive him for his myopic, like not bringing everybody in, maybe a little bit. But at the same time, everybody read the Saturday Evening Post, and creating an ideology from that work, from an illustrator's point of view. It was really powerful. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Yeah, great. I think that's kind of, one more question, and then we'll
Thanks, Tony.
wrap it up.
So one thing I love about your painting is your use of color and your palette. I don't know this photo, and now I'm super curious about it, but you said it was a black and white.
Yeah, it's a freeze frame from a video that was also a freeze frame along with 2 other UFO sightings from military. These were Navy people, like in fighters, that was on the cover of the Times.
So I'm just curious, I mean, I think it's such a beautiful painting, but what informed the color choice of this work?
So my theory is, like, when you're, like, painters always have all these theories, right? When you're in that comfortable zone of painting, and it's kind of like going back into the womb, but you do see the palette of your childhood coming out a little bit. Like that 70s sepia tone stuff from Cheech and Chong and Skateboarder magazine, and like even the 1975 image, probably for TV Guide, had a weird patina to it that I feel like, somebody like Cash Cooper over here, his palette looks a little bit like Klasky Chupo, like cartoons, a little bit from the 90s, like Rugrats and stuff like that. Whereas these kids' like palette looks a little bit like the cartoons and stuff that you guys were watching in the early aughts, right? A little bit, like that palette comes out. So I think for me, when I'm in this sort of safe space in my zone, like the palette of my childhood starts coming out, and I'm looking into the black and white image, and I probably have synesthesia as a thing, but I start seeing color. I really do, and I don't try to change it. I like kind of go with it. Although this one, pulling it into Harbor, I was looking at Turner. But it was weird because like the sunset colors and everything were already here, and I was like, Turner is like such a big help. But the other ones, like this one, I did Google Earth searches for that part of Salem, Mass, and at that time of day to try to get the atmosphere. I researched the cars and what the colors the cars were in the 50s to get the car colors hopefully fairly accurate. For this one, which was the 1971 Costa Rica image, it was taken by a pilot doing a geographic survey for National Geographic. And on a frame of his high-res image camera that was black and white on the bottom of the plane, in one frame, this saucer appeared that they then were able to rescan, and it came out even clearer. But I did Google Earth it. I found that exact lake, the exact part of the lake in Costa Rica. And so I'm looking at the black and white image. I'm also looking at Google Earth for the contemporary color. I didn't make anything up except the shadow. And a little bit of the waves of the lake that I could see in Google Earth that I couldn't see in the black and white image. And it just comes out like that. Like Battle of LA just came out like that. This one is a freeze frame from a famous movie, a video from the 90s, 97 of the Phoenix Lights. And so it's sort of that murky, lot of noise videotape. But then the colors just, I knew that the lights were amber, I guess it was sort of a muted color, but then all those colors just started coming out. And so I just let them be, that's your right brain talking. I always think your unconscious is smart, it just works faster than your consciousness can ascertain. It's like dreaming. And then you wake up and you're like, oh my gosh, I did that, and why are those colors there? But who knows what you're channeling.
All right, well, thank you so much. This is really
Ryan, thank you so much.
No, honestly.
You guys, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I have to say that my dream to have this show at Karma, I'm so grateful and happy, and to have an audience. I always tell people, like, if you have 3 people come, like, it's good, but to have such a wonderful, warm audience that's so attentive. I hope I didn't bore you. I am a motor mouth because I teach too much, but it's my thing. And Ryan, thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah, we're collaborating with
you.
Lucas for the
Yes.
visual narrative art program. I'm so happy to be in the collection. So this is awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
All right.